What's up, everyone? Welcome into the program. It is the Power Grid, Week 14, a special edition of the Audible, our Footballguys.com podcast, of course, our video show as well on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/footballguys, DOTCOM. BJ VanderWoude, David Dodds sitting in as two special guests this week. Double the fun, of course, Jeff Pasquino, John Lee, and I think that's Devin Knotts, minus some flowing locks there, as we're going to jump in, talk about the latest news, all these matchups. I know it's week one of the fantasy playoffs for season long, but for DFS, Dodds, this is a time when things get a little weird in the NFL.
It really does. I mean, I can think back from last few seasons where teams just start, not playing their stars completely. Like I just looked, there's 8 teams with 4 wins or less. So essentially these teams are playing for nothing. And some of them are like Carolina, San Diego seems like a good matchup, but both those teams are likely out of the playoffs. You're really not sure how that's going to go. I would advise people mostly to build lineups with teams that are playing for something where they use their timeouts correctly. They'll end up with more plays in the game, et cetera. So, when you're not playing for anything, if you all of a sudden are behind by 10 points, they just kind of let the clock run, don't do anything to stop it. And the next thing you know, it's like a lot less plays, just a lot less fantasy points.
Right.
Those players are there so they don't get fined.
Yeah. I was going to ask you, Dodds, as Rivers travels to Carolina, and I stumble over English words, the fact that he's going to wear a bolo tie instead of a regular tie, he's not getting suspended for that, right?
Yeah, I guess.
The bolo tie passes, it works?
I think so.
Freaking bolo tie. Who wears a bolo tie? Phillip Rivers. BJ, let's jump into these games with you up next. And if we look at, of course, what's going on with New Orleans and Tampa Bay. This is one that fantasy owners have been looking forward to. This is in Tampa Bay, an outside Drew Brees on the road. It's got a 50-plus point total and a tight spread. Can Tampa Bay keep this close? Does Brees, blow the doors off that Bucs secondary? As we've seen, they can be picked on. Lots of games going to be won and lost by playing this one contest the right way. BJ, how are you playing it?
Well, I've been looking forward to it too. It's a DFS gold mine. I think, the start of the fantasy playoffs is going to be a lot of players that are in this game are going to be in the fantasy playoffs too. I think that Tampa Bay does keep it close. I think that they can expose New Orleans secondary as well. But I think if you're looking at the game from a DFS perspective, Brees is a lock for me. And I think you can't go wrong stacking any one of the 3 wide receivers, Willie Snead, Brandon Cooks, or Michael Thomas. Early in the year, actually, against Arizona, Tampa Bay let 3 different wide receivers score. They've let up 15 passing touchdowns on the year. I'm going to go with Michael Thomas as my preferred Brees stack, though, and I'll have heavy exposure to both of them.
All right, Pasquino, this is the time of year things get weird, but I also want you to play weatherman, so I want you to point at stuff. We'll green screen Dennis Pitta heart throb in later, but weather, several games could be a factor, including one that maybe we wouldn't normally think of, but it looks like Miami, there's going to be 20-mile-an-hour winds, maybe some drizzle in that. You've got Pittsburgh, Buffalo with some weather. It looks like Green Bay, Seattle, more weather. And as we saw last week, the snow flies during football time this time of year. What's it mean for DFS plays?
Well, as the calendar clicks over to December, you really got to look at now the buys are over. Now you have to look at all the weather implications. So NFLweather.com, we have weather reports as well, but you need to stay up to date on it, especially Sunday morning because things can change quickly. But right now, it looks like on Sunday, the upper Midwest is going to see some cold temperatures, maybe some snow, some wind. You mentioned the rain and wind for Miami. This is one of the reasons I like the Detroit game and the Tampa Bay game, warm weather and a dome. So if you can find a dome, you know that you're going to be in a good environment, a good playing surface. I'm going to mention kickers because it does impact the weather, but it also impacts passing. So you got to keep an eye on both those things and really keep that in mind. And if it's adverse conditions, you're going to favor the running game in those contests.
Yeah, so keep an eye on that. Is there any one site that we all would recommend? I mean, I just check out, of course, footballguys.com and our weather updates. We're going to get that all the way up to game time, Dodds, correct? So everyone can just keep track of the weather there.
Yep. Yeah, NFLweather.com is probably the one that you can just find it really fast. It shows the matchup, the time, and then when you click details, it'll actually show it by quarter of what each of the games looks like. So, I mean, that's a really good site that just specializes in NFL weather.
Right. Hey, you're going to specialize in something, right? Devin, you specialize in cutting your hair. Beautiful hair job, by the way. And also Cincinnati at Cleveland. I feel this one like the Tampa-New Orleans game where people have been waiting. You know, you're sitting on Andy Dalton. You're sitting on Tyler Eifert. You're hoping Tyler Boyd can be a cheaper play, GPP play perhaps. It is against Cleveland with Robert Griffin III, so people are thinking Bengals defense as well. How are you approaching this as Vegas has this game as a Bengals win, but in a lower scoring affair? What's the right way to play Cincy at Cleveland, especially with weather, Devin?
Yeah, for those that don't recognize me, John Lee and I had a nice little wager after the game, and Ladarius Green hit value, and I ended up shaving my head. But that's another story. Regarding the Cleveland-Cincinnati game, the weather is going to be an issue. So currently they're expecting a little bit of snow with it to progress throughout the day. As you mentioned, the line, the total has dropped, and we'll get into Vegas in a minute. But Jeremy Hill just makes for a very nice play in this game, because if it is snowing, if there is weather concerns, then they don't need to throw the ball. The Cleveland front seven is just so bad that they can just run the ball and run the ball and run the ball. They can throw short passes to Tyler Eifert, as Cleveland is one of the worst defensive teams against tight ends. So those are probably the two that I'm really targeting. I don't really love Andy Dalton or any of the wide receivers in this game, just because I don't think that Cincinnati needs to do anything more than just run the ball and throw short passes to Eifert.
We are done with the bye week blues, John, but one of the last teams to have their bye last week was Tennessee. Now they're at home facing Denver. They've been preparing for this Broncos team, and they've been preparing to run it down their throat because that's what works. And with Demarco Murray, who looked a little bit banged up entering the bye, you had Mike Mularkey suggesting that we'd see more of Derrick Henry. What are the roles they're in for those two, plus Delanie Walker? We know the Broncos historically are weak against tight end. Brandon Marshall says he feels good, but I don't trust players that comment on their own injury situation, so they could be down a linebacker. So Walker, Murray, Henry, and of course this reflects on Mariota. Rushing quarterbacks are something that also gives the Broncos defense some fits. How are you playing this contest? We know on the Denver side there's plenty of huge question marks and not necessarily fantasy relevant, as they'll be super conservative, even if it is a banged-up Trevor Simeon. But the Tennessee side is very exotic. I talked to Marcus Mariota this week. I asked him, where in the hell did that name come from? And he said, I have no idea. It didn't come from this locker room, but it's exotic smash mouth. How are you playing it this week against him?
Yeah, it's an interesting situation because, this Derrick Henry, he's kind of the wild card. Over the past few games, of course, he was out with the Colts a few weeks ago. He only played 3 snaps. But in weeks 10 and 12, he had 19 and 14 snaps respectively. And he averaged a touch about every other snap during those games. So, if we can predict his snap count, he's seeing quite a bit of action based on the amount of time he's being on the field. That said, I think he's still too expensive. Looking over at DraftKings this week, he's $5,200. And if I'm paying that much, I'm getting a guy who's going to be on the field the whole time. And arguably a guy like Ryan Matthews, he's a $1,200 discount this week. And I'd much rather have him or even Frank Gore, who I think is about $4,900. It's still a discount. So I think you can pretty much eliminate Derrick Henry from most contests, maybe a GPP flyer in less than 3% of your total exposure on this weekend. So I think that's a pretty strong take on him. With regards to DeMarco Murray, he's always in play, especially against a defense that has shown, as you've already pointed out, can't really defend the run very well. Last week, the combination of TJ Yeldon and Denard Robinson combined for 110 rushing yards against this defense. So a guy like Demarco Murray behind this big offensive line, coming off of a week of rest, yeah, he should be in a good spot. And I think that, as you pointed out, Marcus Mariota, his ability to run and keep defenses honest should be able to really help out, because we do know that the Tennessee Titans don't bring a whole lot in terms of wide receivers and receiving options outside of Delanie Walker. If you're going with one person, though, I'll go back to it and I'll say that Demarco Murray is the play here on the Tennessee side of the ball.
Well, we know last week Denver had that Bortles parachute. Like, just keep it close. Bortles will screw it up. You don't have that with Mariota. Super quick before we get to Vegas, fellas, just because it's very interesting. I think this one is going to be big for DFS players this week. Give me the green or the red, or thumbs up, thumbs down, whatever you got. On Matt Forte this week, I understand we'll get to it when we talk running backs, but it is against San Francisco. You have a team that, is not – they're going with Bryce Petty, and it's all green. It's all green. Pasquino, tell us why briefly. San Francisco Jets. I know we could bring up Kaepernick too, but I just wanted to take a Forte poll.
It's such a game script that lines up for Forte. It's ridiculous. And the 49ers have proven that they can't stop anybody, even if they know it's coming. I mean, they only can put 11 guys on the field, and none of them can seem to tackle that first guy. Forte is just going to pound it in there and be the support for Bryce Petty this week. And this is really the test of how bad is that San Francisco defense. I think we all know it's pretty darn bad, because the Jets are going to give them the ball plenty of time. Well, Powell may even be a value play deep, because the second running backs have done some damage. But I think this is a great week, and Forte is one of my top backs this week.
Yeah, I've got Powell as a GPP play, flyer play this week, as now we get to Vegas. And, BJ, you're going to kick us off with Vegas. Everyone gets a take on what it's telling you. What is Sin City saying about some of these games we're discussing this week?
Well, I think that it's interesting because Tampa Bay and New Orleans is the only game that's over 50. But you have, I think it's 9 games between 45 and 48, which is kind of that middle tier, which, that to me means those games could go either way, right? That could be a 38-point game, or it could be a 55-point, or a 50 to 55-point game. So I think, concentrating on some of those teams, David was talking earlier about, and Devin as well, about concentrating on teams that either have something to play for, or are rookies that are going to be playing hard to close out the season. They're not going to be mailing it in. Well, if you kind of look at that meat of the over-unders there, I think it gives you some good games to target in that area. Specifically Green Bay, Seattle, I think is a good one. New England and Baltimore, Giants, Cowboys, as well as the Bills and the Steelers, because I think the Bills, are going to play hard regardless under Rex Ryan.
John, let's talk Vegas with you and all this line movement. What's it telling you in Week 14?
Well, I think, we've already talked a little bit about the weather this week. That's one thing that is really going to affect if the weather patterns are real on Sunday. Now, we record this on Thursday evening, but on Sunday, that's what I always look for. I get a lot of questions on Twitter, and certainly we'd love to answer those questions. But the truth is, I don't know what's going to happen. So what I do is go to my Vegas websites, and I see what the lines are, and I see if they're affected. And if they're affected dramatically, that's how I make my decisions. If it's a half point, if it's a point, I don't think that that's a major issue, because that can happen if a whale comes in and makes a big splash there on one side. But if it's 2 points or more, I think that's fairly dramatic, and that's probably enough to move me away from a given game. Last week, I kind of like Kaepernick against the Bears defense, but once I saw the weather there, I thought it was smart to get away from him, and thank goodness I did, because I almost ended up with more fantasy points than he did last week, and I didn't leave my living room. So this week, though, there's going to be a lot of traps, as some of the guys have already pointed out. This is we're getting to that point in the season where you do have to watch exactly what you're doing. For me, the one game that I'm kind of peaking at is San Diego and Carolina. I think, as others have said, Carolina is probably mailing it in. And San Diego, despite a plethora of injuries throughout the season, still manages to put points on the board every week. Luke Kuechly is back this week, and he's practicing. So I think that Panthers front seven should get a lot better in defending the run. They've been pretty miserable over the past few weeks in defending the run without him. And so for that reason, I like Phillip Rivers and his receiving core to tear apart this Panthers secondary and do so in a fashion that puts a lot of points on the board. And I think Vegas agrees with that sentiment.
The Chargers game seems like a good jumping off point for you, Dodds, when we discuss Vegas.
Yeah, that's an interesting game for sure. And it's interesting because it started as a 49. It stayed there, but now Carolina's only a 1.5 point favorites coming off a 3-point favorite to open up. One that I think is interesting is, and we talked a little bit about New Orleans, Tampa Bay, but I'm interested in how the line moved. It opened at 51 under over. It's now at 51.5. That's not very significant, but it opened as a pick'em, and now Tampa Bay is a 2.5 point favorite. And I think some of that could be based on the theory that Michael Thomas may not play. And I know BJ said that was his favorite stack, but that's something that we probably want to watch. He has been missing practice, and he may not go. And that may funnel things quite a bit differently. So all of a sudden, if you still are on Breeze, like a Breeze, Brandon Cook stack obviously becomes extremely in play if Michael Thomas is out. The game that I don't think a lot of people are talking about that I love, and my game predictor thought it would be about 2 to 3 points higher, is the Washington-Philadelphia game. Philadelphia has been pretty much awful as of late, and Washington's offense, passing offense, has been quite stellar as of late. So that's a lineup that I like a lot, is that Washington-Philadelphia. It's a 46.5, showing Washington to win by 2, but like I said, my game predictor software says it'll go a little higher. So
give me a green or a red on Deshaun Jackson going off this week. Doesn't it seem like that's a possibility?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. Dodds was just talking about it. Devin, you hate Ladarius Green, but what games do you love in Week 14?
Yeah, I think the one that I'm really looking at is the Indian – 2 games, really. The first is the Colts-Texans game, and then the second is the Falcons-Rams game. And I'll touch base on the Falcons-Rams game a little bit. Julio Jones and Mohamed Sanu are both questionable for this game, but yet the Falcons are still 6.5 point favorites, projected to score right around 25 points. So if those two miss and that line stays where it's at, those points are going to have to come from somewhere. So, whether it's Taylor Gabriel, whether it's the running backs, whether it's maybe a tight end, if both of those receivers miss and the line doesn't move, that is significant and something I'll be watching pretty closely on Sunday.
All right, Pasquino, you get to wrap up our Vegas section. What do you got?
They hit a lot of the games I liked. I do want to talk about the Green Bay and Dallas. I think that both those – the thing you want to note there is that both those teams predicted not just to score a lot of points, but they're road favorites. So that usually is going to tend that those run games are going to be favored. I think that Thomas Rawls, who had a remarkable game, I almost called it a personal nightmare for me on Sunday, but I think Rawls and also Ezekiel Elliott are going to be very much in play this week for the running game.
Well, to the position breakdown we go, and we're going to talk chalk, cash, GPP, or fade on all the major positions, and we'll send it around the horn, starting with you, David Dodds, on the quarterbacks and some quarterbacks to watch. Of course, Andrew Luck, limited participant on Wednesday at the shoulder thing. If he goes, seems like he could have a robust day there against Houston. Trevor Simeon with the foot. I watched Simeon at practice today. He was moving around well. It really isn't today for me. It's really tomorrow. Does he, have swelling or soreness that causes him to more limited in tomorrow's practice? And Dodds, I know you've put Simeon in sometimes where he's blown up for you, and he's done some good things. So I want you to discuss quarterbacks and some of your favorites, chalk, cash, GPP, fade this week.
This isn't a Simeon week for me. So I'm just throwing that out there. I actually like the Cam Newton play this week. Again, high under over 7,800. I mean, you got to think back of last year when he was just terrorizing. I mean, he was worth so much more. I mean, that's about as, maybe he's been a few dollars lower, but that seems extremely low. I also think, like I said, I talked about the Washington-Philadelphia game. Kirk Cousins at 7,600. I'm looking more at those moderate price guys. Russell Wilson could be in a shootout. Seattle, Green Bay at 7,900. I'm not really up for spending up for Andrew Luck or Drew Brees or some of the other higher options this week. I'm going to be looking more in that mid-range.
Well, John, you're up, and I wanted to ask you specifically about Russell Wilson and Aaron Rodgers, both in that cold game at Lambeau, and Rodgers, cold weather quarterback, Wilson, cold weather quarterback, and as Dodds said, could be a shootout there. Are you predicting that? And which quarterbacks would you like to go to in Week 14?
So this week is an interesting week. I think the site's really shored up some salaries, at least at the quarterback position. And we're probably going to see some of the most evenly distributed ownership percentages at this position that we've seen all season. So that should make for some really nice cash games. And in terms of tournaments, I love it because it means that we're not going to have a whole lot of chalk and that we can really utilize our edge as analysts and football guys to try to cash in those GPPs. With regard to the game you're talking about, Cease, I think both of these quarterbacks are in play. The Packers still continue to pass the ball more heavily than any team in the league. They're just not committed to the run. I understand completely that Richard Sherman's on the other side, but he's the only guy that I'm kind of afraid of there. And even here, I'm not extremely afraid of him because it's Jordy Nelson going up against him. And Nelson has been pretty close to matchup proof this season with his volume and with his red zone usage. And this week, if you peek at those salaries, Jordy Nelson's really cheap for the type of upside that he brings to the table. I wouldn't encourage anybody to throw him into a cash game lineup, but he's certainly GPP playable because I think most people will be off of him due to this matchup. And this game could go into a shootout because on the other side of the ball, Russell Wilson, he's been able to run a lot more over the past 2 to 3 weeks, and we know that the Packers have never defended rushing quarterbacks very well. So I think that's still a decent play, and it looks like Devin's trying to lose some more hair. Hey, buddy, you're almost out.
I don't have anything else to lose.
All right, so that's addressing the question that was asked. In terms of the guys I'm looking at this week, both of these guys make me a little bit nervous, but I want to spend up elsewhere, and quarterback is the one position where there's the least amount of variance from week to week. So I think I'm going cheap there this week. And the two guys I'm looking at, Carson Palmer, he continues to put up big numbers. I mean, he doesn't look pretty doing it, but if you look at his game logs, I think he has 290 yards or more in like 6 of his past 7 games, and he's really cheap across the industry. And the one I like more, and you might want to talk me off the ledge here, anybody can do it, Colin Kaepernick, coming off of being benched last week against the Jets. The Jets are a funnel defense. They're dead last in the league in pass defense. They're seconds in terms of running. All the pieces are there, I think, for Kaepernick to have a decent game. I don't think he has a slew of upside, but I think he has 20-point potential, which is something he's hit in, I think, 5 of his last 6 games, with last week being the obvious exception.
All right, well, he's Devin Knotts. He's apparently clean-shaven, ladies. And, Devin, you're up with this one. You're saying you got the red out for almost everything John's saying. What's up?
I do like Aaron Rodgers. I do like Carson Palmer. The issue I have with Russell Wilson is a lot of people are going to say, oh, he went to Wisconsin. Well, he was in Wisconsin for about 3.5 months during his college career. He's played 2 games in his career under 32-degree temperatures. So he's really unproven in the snow, in the weather up in Green Bay. So it's a little bit of a red flag for me. In cash games, I just can't do it when there are better options. One of the guys that I do like quite a bit is I'm actually on Andrew Luck this week, and because it's inside, it's in a dome. They don't really have a running game because Frank Gore how many carries does Frank Gore have left in his career? Not very many. So Luck is a guy that I'll be using in cash. I'm spending up quite a bit because I can spend down at the running back position, or which we'll get into in a minute. But I will be spending up for the Breeze Luck. Not on Brady, but maybe a little Stafford as well.
All right, well, let's move on to that running back position. And, BJ, you're up first, and some interesting situations. We've talked a lot about New Orleans, Tampa already. Well, are you trusting Mark Ingram with multiple injuries. Of course, David Johnson, is he worth it? You got the who's playing Cleveland. Oh, yeah, it's Jeremy Hill. Are you throwing in Rex Burkhead as a GPP play like I would Bilal Powell? Some interesting situations going on at the running back position. BJ, your thoughts?
Well, I don't trust Ingram when he's healthy, so I'm certainly not trusting him with a couple of injuries. So that I think, David Johnson's been incredible. I think, if you're looking at GPP, if you're looking for an anchor for your GPP teams, it's really easy to put him in your lineup and move on. And talking about Carson Palmer earlier, he's actually, hasn't hit his ceiling, but he's done enough because he's been so cheap with the passing yards that he's actually been pretty effective in GPP lineups. This week, they mentioned earlier, there's 19-mile-an-hour winds, in that Arizona-Miami game, which obviously favors the run game. So Johnson might have even more work than he's already had, if that's even possible, because he dominates the offense to begin with. But you're talking about Matt Forte going against a historically bad 49ers run defense. You mentioned Jeremy Hill. All on Jeremy Hill the last time he played Cleveland. I think he had 9 carries for 168 yards and a touchdown. And the thing that I'm really impressed with, actually, is the fact that he's catching passes. He's had 9 receptions over his last 2 games as a feature running back, which, he's kind of picked up where Gio, took away from him. And, in that timeshare when they were both playing, it's really hard to put a guy who depends on touchdowns in your lineup, especially when it's Cincinnati and they're not moving the ball earlier in the year without Eifert and A.J. Green was dominating the offense. But Demarco Murray's another guy I like this week. He's been incredible this year. And another guy who's catching passes that you probably didn't think so early in the season. He has 45 receptions already. So those are a couple guys I'm looking at. I would probably not go Rex Burkhead in the GPP, but I'm a little bit more risk adverse than you.
Well, there's the reason why I call Jeremy Hill Costco. Go get your 5 pounds of mayonnaise at Costco. Get it done. Jeremy Hill this week. Pasquino, you're up, man. And we've got a lot to get to at this position. And guys with maybe some tougher matchups. On the flip side, we talked Arizona, but we didn't talk Jay Ajayi. Anything there in your eyes, Pasquino?
I'm not convinced that he's going to be anything more than a GPP play. I think there's better values throughout the board. I think you can go at the high end for David Johnson because he's going to be probably, with a lot of people scratching their head what to do at this position. He's going to be the default answer. But I'm leaning a lot towards Forte against San Francisco. I think that Hill is definitely in play, but I think Thomas Rawls has to be mentioned as well. I think Rawls and Zeke are going to probably get overlooked, probably a little bit for their price and a little bit for their matchup. But both those teams are favored, and I think that they're going to be depending on the run game to balance out that offense.
When the likes of Akeem Hunt and Jonathan Grimes and Alfred Blue's good, but still those other 2 guys, when they're getting work and you're not, how much confidence do you have in Lamar Miller, Dodds? Let's talk some running backs this week.
I don't think he's healthy. I mean, that's my big concern. He looked all, they pretty much, took him out of the game, and we kind of saw that happening Sunday morning. I mean, I jumped on the Slack channel and said, why are they holding 4 running backs? So he was not healthy last week. The way he's practicing this week, I have zero confidence that Lamar Miller is ready to go. So that would be a great situation against Indianapolis generally, but I'm avoiding it. The ones that nobody seems like they want to talk about, but I do think Frank Gore is in play. He's on FanDuel. He's 6,000. That's like a joke. So you can get him in and make a lot of other fun stuff happen. David Johnson's getting at that price range, and I know it's tough because he just keeps delivering and everything, but with the weather as bad as it is, Miami can beat a bunch of different other ways, but the weather may force it to be more run-oriented. He's been getting most of his yards and pass catching. At 9,700 on FanDuel, it's getting closer and closer to a fade. I'm not sure this is the week to do it, but I do think Le'Veon Bell might actually deliver more fantasy points. He's 9K. I like Jeremy Hill a lot. Thomas Rawls, as mentioned, I think is somebody who really could deliver in a game script. Green Bay has been just awful at the second level of tackling. So if you get past the front on Green Bay, people have just gashed them for huge, huge yards. So I could see a situation where they really try to establish that run against against, Green Bay. Green Bay is going to have to throw a ton just based on kind of how Seattle defends. So, again, that could be a ping-pong game, but where Seattle tries to run a lot more than Green Bay does. And, again, if the Vegas line's correct, where Seattle ends up running a lot of the close out the game as well. So those are just interesting situations. But as the price gets higher and as some of the other pricing gets kind of closer and more etched in right, it's feeling less and less likely that – the weeks of playing both David Johnson and Le'Veon Bell seem over. You're going to have to choose maybe one of those and maybe neither of them this week.
The Thomas Rawls situation reminds me of Rob Kelly facing the Packers a few weeks ago. Like, on paper, Green Bay's really good, and Kelly gets 3 touchdowns. Like,
Speaking of Kelly, I'm going to mention him real quick.
Okay.
So Rob Kelly at 5,900 on FanDuel is too cheap, in my opinion.
Yes.
If you look at Washington's last 2 games, outside of that, he had 3 games ago. He had that huge game against Green Bay. But the last 2 games, they've fallen so far behind that they've just had to abandon the run. This game is expected to be a 2-point game from Vegas. I think Rob Kelly's in a pretty good spot here. Assuming that Washington can keep it close in the first half, he should see 20-plus carries. And if he can score a touchdown, which he's shown that he can do multiple times this year, at 5,900, he doesn't need much to pay off value.
All right, well, let's move to the wide receiver position. And, John, you're up, and we touched on it with Atlanta there with both Julio Jones and Mohamed Sanu banged up. Now, in season-long leagues, I would look at Julio Jones as he's one of the players that if he's on the field, I'm playing him. Perhaps that's stubborn, but there's a certain level of player, and I believe that Jones is that level where if he's out there, you're playing him. DFS, you got to factor in the salary. What kind of salary implications are there for Julio with this toe injury? Again, we're recording on Thursday, John. But how are you looking at this Atlanta thing with the wide receivers? And how are you looking at the wide receivers in general in Week 14?
Yeah, so the Atlanta situation is something that I'm monitoring pretty closely. I'm not a big fan of Taylor Gabriel, and I've gone on record as saying that.
Hey, you and Devin have something in common now.
He's 5'8".
On a stool.
On a stool. There you go. However, this is where we may part ways. This may be a week where I think you can look to him because Julio Jones is dealing with turf toe, and Mohamed Sanu, as of Thursday night, still has yet to practice. And if you look at the matchup facing Taylor Gabriel this week, he's going against E.J. Gaines, who is only about a stool higher in height than Taylor Gabriel. He's 5'10". So if there's ever a week where height will not matter for this guy, it's this week. He continues to be used. Surprisingly, they use him inside the red zone. The only thing that scares me off of him is that I think that in general the field, the DFS player field, is kind of high on this guy right now. And so I think that his ownership levels, despite the fact that they've been too high for the past few weeks, they're probably going to be about appropriate this week. Going back to the original question, Julio Jones is too expensive. There are some elite plays at wide receiver position this week, and you don't have to take the chance with him. I think you have to go towards Mike Evans this week. They have the highest implied team total. A lot of people are going to point in the direction of it being him being shadowed by Delvin Breaux, but Delvin Breaux has been terrible this season in coverage. Last year, he was a guy to avoid. This year, you can target him. He allowed 100 yards in coverage last week. And the week prior, he let up a touchdown to, I believe it was Kenny Britt. I'm not afraid of him at all. So if you're spending up, those are guys I like. If you're spending down, I think Josh Bellamy is interesting. He's getting a lot of targets. I think that he's locked in with that Chicago Bears quarterback. We're seeing that this season. I talked a little bit about that on the show last night, that Cutler locks into Alshon Jeffrey, Hoyer locked on to Meredith, and what we're seeing now with Barkley is that he's locking on to Josh Bellamy, and he's really cheap across the industry, and if you need that salary relief, that's a guy that I wouldn't mind going to. So those are a few guys I've got some GPP plays, but I think I'll save them for later in the show.
Now, John, just because you're a giant man doesn't mean you have to hold it against little, short people. Super quick, John, super quick, just because I want to pick your brain about it. Which Bengals receiver are you picking? Or are you picking a Bengals receiver?
Yeah, I mean, I think you can definitely do it. Joe Hayden no longer scares me there. He's been beaten soundly this season. Initially, when this whole A.J. Green disappearance occurred, I was higher on Tyler Boyd, but I think what I've been seeing is that LaFell is the guy that they're going to a little more often. So it's LaFell for me if I have to make that decision.
All right, Pasquino, you're flashing that green sign. Let's talk wide receivers with you, and including, a Jordan Matthews with an ankle limited participation, the Michael Thomas thing, which we've been talking about. That's very important for fantasy owners to watch. Speaking of injury problems, well, there's Sammy Watkins against the Steelers' bend but don't break defense. How much love you got for wide receivers in Week 14?
I do like Evans, and I think at the top end, I also like Odell Beckham against Dallas. He's had a great history against him. I think he's got a good matchup there. He's been a target hog there, so I think that's a good matchup for him. I think the Deshaun Jackson narrative is real. I think that he's very likely he's auditioning to come back and easily take the top off that defense. Just flipping it real quick to Philadelphia, if you could figure out the running backs that situation in Philadelphia, you'll probably make some money this week because I think that's how they're going to try and tackle Washington against that defense. But going back to wide receivers, one of the top guys I like, again, I'm going back to the well with Golden Tate. He's just on fire, getting a lot of targets. Marvin Jones could probably be out again. Holden's not doing much. Tate's probably going to see another 10 targets against the Bears that are just pretty much given up, and he'll be very productive at a pretty good price. So I'm looking for the lower range wide receivers, probably one high end, one middle with like Tate, and a lower end like a Bellamy or even a Robby Anderson, but that's more of a GPP play. I think that you really want to go for these target hogs in your cash games and be more conservative on those 2 or 3 guys.
JP, if we're talking about Arizona and we've been praising Carson Palmer, it can't be all Fitzgerald. So is there anybody else? It seems like he's just throwing a dart, whoever, from week to week. Are you looking at any of these guys? You got John Brown with the illness and the sickle cell, and Michael Floyd, super hot, hot and super cold. Like, are you looking there at all?
I'm glad you mentioned Arizona because I think that Fitzgerald is great play this week in cash, and I think he's catches a lot of the short passes, and that's good. But I don't see anybody else getting consistent targets aside from the tight end Gresham. I think Gresham's getting a lot of targets for it's not clear why, but he's getting a lot of dump offs, I guess, in the 3rd or 4th look. But probably don't even have him going out for last month he has been. But after Fitzgerald, it's just not consistent enough for me to really target a Nelson or a Brown.
All right, BJ, you get to talk wide receivers with us. And, again, we've gone over quite a few of the injury situations there. So which wide receivers are you looking to in Week 14?
I think at the top end, definitely looking at Odell Beckham. In a tough division game against Dallas. Looking at T.Y. Hilton, he's had some monster games this year. And one of those monster games actually came against San Diego. And don't look now, but Ted Ginn Jr. has scored in his last 3 games and has become a GPP option, which I never thought I'd say. It's completely against kind of the type of wide receivers that I target. But if you're looking at GPP plays, you have to consider him. You have to. I know it's awful, but you have to. There's a lot of value too. In kind of some of them were mentioned like Bellamy, but in the 5K range, I mean, there's some talented wide receivers there. Allen Robinson is 5K now. He gets Xavier Rhodes this week, so I'm not sure he's the best target this week. But the type of talent that's there, Randall Cobb's also at 5K. So you have a lot of guys in that range that you can consider. And this year has been interesting because the play for GPPs has been to spend up at running back and kind of stack those wide receivers, those value wide receivers. And, from the GPP winners that I've seen, it's the ones that can nail, 2 wide receivers in the 4,000 to 5,000 range. So I think there's plenty of options there this week. I think, Cole Beasley at 5,200, Kenny Britt at 5,200, Deshaun Jackson in a revenge game at 5,200. Those are all guys that are in play in GPPs. Probably not cash games, but I'm kind of a GPP guy, so that's kind of where I'm looking in tournaments.
Well, let's move to the tight end position because I don't want Devin to show that helmet again. And Dodds, I'm going to throw this to you, Dodds. A couple things here. First off, on our Football Guys newswire, it looks like Jordan Reed is expected to play. It's coming through the newswire today. Also, Black Unicorn, Martellus Bennett. You have to play a Monday night slate. But damn it, Dodds, can you trust him?
Yeah, he hasn't been healthy all season. I mean, it's clear. I mean, just watch the pass routes he runs. I mean, he has always a chance to score. They will feature him in the end zone, in the red zone kind of area. But I think we just have to see him healthy. I mean, I've taken a few shots at him, and every week I'm like, wow, he just can't move. I mean, those ankles are taped so badly. He's just not somebody I'm going to trust. The tight ends that jump off my board this week, Jimmy Graham in a great situation, I think, against Green Bay is probably the top of my board. Reed should be there against a really good matchup, but I'd like to see more of him play first. I mean, he was 100% healthy. He probably would be up at that thing. And then again, that San Diego Carolina game, if there really is 50 points in play, you got to think Greg Olsen will be a big part of that. He's only at 6,400 on FanDuel. So FanDuel's all of a sudden kind of lower the prices. I mean, Jimmy Graham, 6,600, Greg Olsen, 6,400. It's hard for me to look further down the board when you have to pay 5,700, 5,800 for way lesser guys. So to me, it seems like you're paying at the top of the end, but the top end used to be like 7,500 for tight ends, and now it's 6,500 or so. So at that price, I'm looking at the top of the board. I'm going to pencil in Jimmy Graham, Greg Olsen in most of my lineups.
Boom, make it happen. Dodds, when the hell are they going to get Gates that touchdown record? It doesn't have to be in one game, but my God.
It's going to have to be next year, I think. I don't know.
Well, he's talking about next year. So, Devin, you're up. Let's talk some tight ends with you. And Cameron Brate, we know Jameis loves to lean on that tight end position. Is that a guy you'll be leaning on in Week 14?
Yeah, I mean, even going back to college, Jameis Winston had Nick O'Leary, which he seemed to lock on to. So Jameis has a tendency to lock on to his tight end. It's really the second option in this offense. I think the problem is, as David mentioned, is that the top tight ends are just relatively affordable. I mean, you look at, even on DraftKings, both Greg Olsen and Delanie Walker are under 5K. Those are probably the two that I'm going with over there just because you can afford them pretty easily. Brate has only one touchdown in his last 3 games after scoring 3 touchdowns in 3 consecutive games. He's probably more of a GPP play for me this week than a cash game play. Just because I'm finding myself being able to afford Delanie Walker, Greg Olsen, Jimmy Graham. The Broncos, I think, and you could probably give us some clarification on this, but they are going to shut down. They're not going to have an issue with the Tennessee wide receivers if Marcus Mariota.
They may put Aqib Talib on Delanie Walker. Now, that's nothing I've seen from practice because, I mean, I can't say what I've seen at practice. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying in years past they've taken Talib and put him on top tight ends.
That scares me a little bit then. So that's good information. So that downgrades Walker for me a little bit because Talib is one of the best cornerbacks in football. So, I think Olsen. It's really Olsen is probably my guy this week.
All right, John. I know you don't want to talk about kickers, so you're up in the tight end section. And again, a lot of things to get to. And as we lean on the who's playing Cleveland, well, it's Eifert. So how much love there?
Yeah, you've got to like Tyler Eifert. His usage in the red zone is always elite. They haven't used him as much recently, but this is certainly a spot where you can get behind him. I'm all for it. So I have no problems with Tyler Eifert this week. A couple of the guys that you can be looking at, I think, is Zach Ertz. He's at double-digit targets in the past 2 out of the past 3 weeks. And if DGB, Duro Green Beckham, does not play and he hasn't practiced yet this week, I think you'll see continued high usage for him. And, I'll go back to the one you talked about, and that's Antonio Gates. He had, the last 2 weeks he's had 0 and 4 targets respectively, which I think is troubling. But I'm okay with going after guys who have historical, basically historically he's good, and they'll come back to him. And if they're going to go after this record, there's no better team to do it against than the Carolina Panthers, who allow the fourth most points to the tight end position in terms of fantasy production. So I wouldn't recommend it in a cash game situation, but certainly for GPPs, I think Antonio Gates is in play. For cash games, I do agree with Dodds, though. You want to spend up of some of these guys that have elite matchups because they're too cheap.
And now we get to the section of the program we call the Jeff Pasquino Special. It's defenses and kickers. JP, take it away.
Well, kickers, it's interesting week on kickers and FanDuel. There's a lot of cheap options. There's a dozen guys at the minimum, like 4,500. So I think that's going to be the trend. A lot of people are going to look for that cheap guy that they really want to play. But and there's a bunch of teams. You want to target teams that are like getting projected for 24 or more points, preferably playing in good weather conditions and at home. So that really leads towards Tampa Bay, Detroit, and New Orleans. They're both projected to score a lot. But I can't trust Aguayo. I think he'll miss a ball on a tee. I think that the guy that I'm really looking at is Prater. He's going to be a little bit lesser owned, and he's $4,900, and he has just put up 8+ points in 6 straight. And if you want to save a little bit more money, I'm looking at Brandon McManus at 4,600. I know that Denver's not scheduled to score as much, but he's really been the offense. He scored 8 to 13 points in 9 straight weeks. And the last one I'll mention, and this is a good correlation factor, Minnesota and Kai Forbath. The defense and the kickers correlate very well. Minnesota is one of the top defenses on the board this week. I'll let the other guys mention the others, but Minnesota is probably one of the top ones against Jacksonville, which is terrible. Blake Bortles, and Forbath is the minimum. So I like him this week.
Dodds, you're flashing the black-eyed Joe. Any defensive
Love
kicker
Roberto. Roberto's 4,500. He's one of my top kickers this week. So just a general strategy component here when you're playing GPPs, how I like to build lineups. I mean, obviously we look at those Vegas odds and expected points. But if you're going to fade a game, so let's just say that New Orleans-Tampa Bay game, you aren't taking that. If you aren't taking Tampa Bay players, you're building your stacks a different way. That's a really great way to hedge and go with like a Roberto Aguayo and just say, hey, I'm going to win my GPP by Tampa Bay scoring more field goals instead of the position players. So everybody that are playing the Tampa Bay stack. So just something to consider for like high under over games that maybe you aren't on it as much. Like, oh, I really am favoring some of these other players, but take advantage of that by playing a kicker. You know, most people won't have a kicker because that would have covariance with the skill players they're playing. So the chance of them playing that kicker is less. So Robert Aguayo, I mean, like I said, I mean, I love Prater. I'm not going to disagree. That's probably if I can get him in my lineup, I like that a lot. But I think all of a sudden, because I think so many people will be playing Tampa Bay players, I think he's in play for me, especially in GPPs at 4,500.
BJ, any thoughts on defenses or kickers this week?
I think it's, I typically try to spend up on defenses or look for a matchup to exploit, kind of like Cincinnati and Cleveland. You can do that just by looking at the bad quarterbacks. Not a whole lot of them, but they're out there. This week I think the Vikings and the Broncos are at the top, and justifiably so. I'll probably have heavy exposure to both of them. The Falcons, going into Los Angeles, I could see them absolutely blowing the doors off, forcing Goff to pass a lot, and them really punishing them on defense. So that's kind of a sneaky one, 3,100 on DraftKings, probably fits pretty easily into your lineups. Don't have too strong opinion on defenses otherwise, though.
Well, let's get into our stacks, and everyone gets to talk about them. And let's start with Devin and his favorite stacks in Week 14.
Yeah, a couple good ones just off the top. So I think Drew Brees, depending on this Michael Thomas situation, I'm looking more at Brandon Cooks. I almost want Michael Thomas to play if I'm gonna go with the Brandon Cooks stack. I think that a lot of people are scared off of Cooks because he has been bad this year, but this game is in one of the highest scoring games, and he could have a pretty good opportunity to be one of the under-owned receivers. I don't like Willie Snead. All of his touchdowns have come at home, and he really isn't targeted all that much. So going on the road scares me a little bit. And then I think what I've noticed, at least in this show, and I don't know if it's across the board, but the Pittsburgh stack seems no one's really talking about it. So no one mentioned Antonio Brown, no one mentioned Ben Roethlisberger. So it is a little bit worrisome in Buffalo in December, but this is a stack that we've seen just have monster days. So they're one of my top stacks, especially if they go overlooked, which they might be based on just some initial. It's only Thursday, so it could change, but those are probably my top two stacks of the week.
John, you're up with your stacks, and let's jump off from that Ben AB stack because it has been on the road. And as a Steelers fan, I'll tell you, and as everybody knows, like it's just not as good.
Oh, you're asking my opinion. My apologies. I thought you were going somewhere further with that. The thing about that stack is it's just so expensive. And for that reason, you can take two ways to look at it. One is, hey, because it's so expensive and because salaries are tight this week, it'll be low owned. I don't have a problem with it. It certainly has upside, and that's what you look for in a stack. In terms of how much ownership it'll have, I think that ultimately is where I come into play, whether or not I love it or not. And it's still a bit early in the week to know exactly where everybody's going to fall in terms of ownership. The two that I'm looking at right now, Doug Baldwin with Russell Wilson. Doug Baldwin's got an excellent coverage play this week against Micah Hyde. Hyde's allowing a 75% completion rate this year. When quarterbacks throw into his coverage, their quarterback rating is over 140. He's allowed 3 touchdowns over the past month. He's been absolutely dreadful, and Baldwin should see him almost all day on Sunday. Another guy I like is Phillip Rivers with Tyrell Williams. Williams, I've already talked how I do like this game, but Williams has been red hot as of late, and he's going up against Daryl Worley, who has not been able to cover anybody all season. And I like him quite a bit because I think that despite the type of upside he brings to the table, he continues to go under-owned in DFS circles for one reason or another.
All right, BJ, you're up with your Week 14 stacks. Who do you like?
I mentioned Drew Brees and Michael Thomas. Obviously, that's dependent on Thomas's health. I think you can move down the line. Brandon Cooks, great target, has given, the type of wide receiver that has given Tampa Bay some fits too. And I think both Snead and Cooks have that speed factor, and can get it done. And I think they're probably really good options. Andrew Luck and T.Y. Hilton. I think that's a divisional game. Houston's not really in it, but Indy's still trying to climb its way back. I think that's a good stack. Hilton has had some huge games this year. His price is pretty good, I think, relative to other wide receivers. He's at 7,500 on DraftKings. Think about Evans is almost $1,400 higher than him. You can justify Evans' price by his targets, his consistency. But if you're looking at just total ceiling, Hilton's up there with just about any player, there. So I think Carson Palmer and Larry Fitzgerald is a stack that I consistently play every week in my GPPs. Although that could be a reason why I'm not doing too well lately. So. And I think a sneaky one that's kind of coming back in vogue is Dez Bryant. I think he's a guy, and Dak Prescott. He hasn't gone, completely nuclear yet, but I feel like it's in him. It's going to happen, especially with Ezekiel Elliott running the way that he is. There's going to be a game where he gets behind the secondary twice, and I think despite the Giants secondary playing really well, he's had some big games in the past against them. As a Giants fan, I remember them very, very well. So I think he's a guy that I'm looking at this week. And obviously, Jordy Nelson's price kind of dictates the stack with Aaron Rodgers this week. That's one that I think you can get much cheaper than you probably ever thought you would be able to get him at any point this year. So those are the guys that I'm looking at kind of at the higher end too.
All right, Dodds, we can say you've been doing rather well.
I have been doing rather well
this year, so I'm going to get my pen ready. Pen ready and take some notes. Who you got?
I think my number one stack is an unconventional stack, but it's going to be Cincinnati defense and Jeremy Hill. So both are very well priced. You can get them both, and it's a situation that you're going to play RG3 potentially in the snow. So if that doesn't end up with a bunch of turnovers and interceptions and touchdowns and all the like, and then again, hopefully in that game, if Cincinnati does get up big, or at least there's a probability that they could end up big, just a ton of Jeremy Hill at the end to close out that game. The counter to that game, counter to that stack is one I also have some exposure to is Andy Dalton to Brandon LaFell at $13,500 on FanDuel. Just extremely cheap. I mean, you basically can go with that and probably pay up, get David Johnson, get Le'Veon Bell, which I think most people wouldn't be able to assemble a team to look like that with some other value plays. So just have a GBP roster that looks unlike so many other rosters that should still be extremely competitive. And then people have talked about the Seattle-Green Bay game. Because I'm so much already going to be in on Jimmy Graham, I will definitely have Russell Wilson, Jimmy Graham stacks. And then if that's successful, expect Green Bay, who has no run game, to pass. So whether it be Jordy Nelson or Devontae Adams or, just their different options as well in kind of a catch-up game and kind of a power stack. So those are the ones I'm looking at. Golden Tate's price cheap as well. Matthew Stafford, Golden Tate makes sense to me. And like people said, Aaron Rodgers, Jordy Nelson. If I'm going to play that stack, I'm probably also going to play Jimmy Graham in a shootout game where there's just all kind of ping-pong scoring. So those are the ones I'm mostly looking at this week.
All right, Pasquino, you tie a bow on the stack section. What do you got for Week 14?
I think good stacks mentioned already. I'll mention a couple. I think Cam Newton is in play for some stacking. I think Teddy Ginn and Greg Olsen in a super stack. Added those guys in. That's barely over $11,000 on FanDuel for those receivers. So anytime you can get two receivers for under $14,000, I think that's definitely in play. So I think that's a good one. I think even though that the Tampa Bay New Orleans game is going to be targeted by everybody, as Dodds and John has said, everybody's going to be on different tight ends. So I think Cameron Brate and if Mike Evans in is pricier, but definitely Cameron Brate and Jameis Winston is a good way to play that game. I think those guys are going to be well owned. Now, let's pretend last Sunday didn't happen for a moment. Kaepernick, Vance McDonald, is a definite stack, and you can pretty much do whatever you want in the rest of those savings. And if you really want to game stack it, Robby Anderson on the other side, because that guy he's under $5,000. He's a constant threat, and that Bryce Perry loves to throw it to him deep. He did it several times. It finally connected with him once in that pitiful game on Monday. But those three guys are dirt cheap. You put those three guys in, you can pretty much put whatever running backs and wide receivers you want around those guys.
Here's the hot tip. The only reason Bryce Petty loves Robby Anderson so much is because when you open up your first mutt pack on Madden Ultimate Team, Anderson's one of the cheap cards you get.
And Bryce Petty's also there too.
I remember that guy. Let's plug him into the lineup. Devin, you wish last week didn't happen. So you got your flowing locks of hair. But let's get some party thoughts. Devin, what do you got?
Yeah, so a couple things. I think one is you don't have to spend up at running back this week. The past couple weeks, I think everyone has said spend up on running backs, find a way to pay up for Le'Veon Bell, find a way to pay up for David Johnson, put them together, and then that's how you build your running backs. I think there are so many other options this week that you don't have to go to those two. So that's kind of, Jeremy Hill is going to be in a lot of my cash games. I'm going to be spending up at quarterback and spending up at receiver because there are fewer elite options this week. So I typically look at which has the biggest scarcity as far as elite options, and then we go from there.
BJ, what are some parting thoughts for our viewing and listening audience that can help them not only this week but for the rest of the season as well?
Well, I think this year has been kind of a unique year, for DFS, especially, NFL. The strategies that have worked in the past in terms of lineup construction, at least what I do, have not necessarily been what has worked this year in terms of positional importance and where you spend your money. In the past, there were a lot of pass-catching running backs. And if you look, there's kind of an absence of the scat back this year in terms of actual receptions, not coming from the top end, your Le'Veon Bells and your David Johnsons. They're getting, their catches. But the guys who are, would be 4,500, your Woodheads, your Charles Sims of last year, Sproles in the past, those guys. It's almost like those guys don't exist this year. So that has been a source of value for me in the past. I kind of realized it probably a couple weeks too late. And kind of switched up my lineup construction strategy, and I'm kind of seeing my results improve since then. But you kind of have to seriously look at compare positions in terms of pricing, right? And if you see the wide receivers, a lot of them are overpriced this year. They're not producing like they have in the past, and that's why paying up for running back, was the way to succeed most of the season. But now their prices have started to increase too. So how do you counter that? I think by finding the value at both wide receiver and running back, and don't pigeonhole yourself into I have to spend up for David Johnson. As Devin said, actually, look for the value because it's there. We mentioned Jordy Nelson. He used to be, he was 8K because when the top guys are producing, it moves everybody else up as their price goes up because it has to stay consistent. And so I think you just have to kind of really look at the point per dollar plays. Where are they producing, and find the value. And I think it's there this week, especially at wide receiver.
John Lee knows how to do DFS kung fu. Probably has a pair of Zubaz pants and wants a roundhouse kick to the face. The short people. But anyway, John, parting thoughts for Week 14.
All right, so I have a few GPP thoughts that I didn't get to share throughout the show, so I'll just throw those out now. A couple of guys that I didn't get a chance to mention. Keep your eye on what's going on there in New Orleans in terms of practice this week. Ingram did not practice today. Michael Thomas did not practice today. And the thing that's most frustrating about rostering the Saints is that you never know who's going to get the ball. Well, if those guys continue not to practice through tomorrow, meaning Friday, that really narrows it down for us. So, don't sleep on that. From my perspective, one guy you can look at there in GPPs is Tim Hightower. Nobody's going to have him. Nobody will have him. He'll be less than 5% owned and probably less than 3% owned. And Tampa Bay is susceptible to the run. I think they're allowing something like 4.4 yards per carry this season, and they can be beaten even by the likes of Tim Hightower. So that's number one. I have three here. Number two, Jordan Matthews gets an elite matchup this week against Kendall Fuller. Kendall Fuller's been beaten out of the slots almost throughout the season, without exception. And before he got hurt, Jordan Matthews had 4 straight 10-target games from Carson Wentz. That's where he likes to throw. And we also already know that, that Nelson Aguilar is out of flavor. Paul Turner was on the practice squad a few weeks ago. And Dorial Green-Beckham is not practicing. So there may be a slew of volume to be had there for Jordan Matthews this week. And then the last thing is not necessarily a recommendation, but it's a game strategy thought that it's David Johnson. We keep going back to this guy. He has been an absolute stud all season. That goes without saying. He's $10,000. And in your cash games, if you want to throw him in there, certainly do it. He continues to pay off. But I think there's a real risk in running him out in GPPs moving forward until his ownership levels drop. Last week, I was in the $300 monster on FanDuel. 2,200 people in that tournament. And he was 55% owned, which is absolutely insane. In the $9 slant on DraftKings, he was 35% owned. His ownership is way too high for the type of price that he's being offered at. And furthermore, what he does is he forces you to build your rosters in a certain way because you're spending 20% of your salary on one guy. So you have to go cheap then at wide receiver. You have to go cheap elsewhere.
Right.
So really your roster diversity, your composition within that roster is very, very limited. And so my recommendation to everybody out there is to limit yourself to David Johnson moving forward until his price comes down. And I think that you're going to see that your chances of winning GPPs will be increased as a result.
Time for parting thoughts from Jeff Pasquino. Take it away, kind sir.
Yeah, I agree with the bit on what John said. And I think that if you're going to fade David Johnson, you got to think about the game script and from those games that favors that. So you're going to lean towards your Carson Palmers to Larry Fitzgerald's. That's going to really dictate, I'd say getting away from David Johnson. But this week is a little bit rough, I think. There's no free squares. There's no guarantee how you got to put in. There's no absolutely must starts. So I really need to the matchups a little bit harder this week. Look at the analysis that we have on all the different articles and make some bold calls. I think that I'm looking at the really bad defenses, and I'm sticking with those. I'm sticking with Matt Forte against San Francisco. I'm looking at Golden Tate, who's a target hog. I'm looking for guys that are consistent, and I'm starting from there, and then just build around that. But yeah, liking the free squares makes it a little bit difficult, a little bit more challenging. But that's a lot of people are going to be thinking that way this week.
All right, David Dodds, what are your parting thoughts?
Yeah, John Lee stole my Jordan Matthews. That was one of my best. And I think that's exactly right. I mean, DJB, it looks like a complete scratch. And I think that could be, like I said, my game predictor really like that as a shootout game. I think Jordan Matthews would be the finishing piece of that. Somebody we haven't mentioned is Emmanuel Sanders at FanDuel, $5,900, just extremely underpriced. I mean, his price has dropped immensely. So, again, watch the news, find out who's going to be the quarterback there. But I just think there are quite a few. Golden Tate's been mentioned. Brandon Cooks, if Thomas scratches. So I think this week is just setting up to be what's the Friday news, what's the Sunday morning news look like, and be ready to be flexible. Like right now, I may not have David Johnson in my lineup, but if I can get Golden Tate, Brandon Cooks, and Jordan Matthews all in really plus situations because of other people scratching, now all of a sudden I've saved so much that it's going to be pretty easy to fit David Johnson in your lineup as well. So kind of watch that. Again, parting shots, I'll talk a lot about my cash plus strategy. So people that just play 50-50s, I consider that kind of a losing strategy. And I think the best way I have found to win in these DFS contests is build a cash plus lineup, which is basically stacking your quarterback either with a running back with a wide receiver or tight end. I also generally like to stack my defense and running back, which Jeremy Hill, Cincinnati, sets up for a great situation that week doing that. But basically it's a cash plus where those lineups can also finish really well in 100-man contests and 5X contests and 3X contests. So you don't have to have as much money in play, but you have certainly the high reward if those lineups hit. So just something I think some people should mention, as opposed to I've seen people that'll put thousands and thousands into 50-50 lineups. But essentially, if you play that same lineup across all of those, if you don't score that, you're either going to win them all or lose them all. But this cash plus strategy, you can build some lineups with Carson Palmer and Larry Fitzgerald. You can have some with Aaron Rodgers to Jordy Nelson, and you just build those stacks plus the other players around it, have a diversity of lineups, but have some upside that goes with those lineups as well. Has really done well for me this year.
Now it is December. Sports fans, of course, will be thinking of NBA, which leads us to Devin and Hoops Guys. What's going on over at Hoops Guys, man?
Yeah, so if you've seen me look away from my computer, it's because we recorded this at about 5 p.m. Central, 6 p.m. Eastern, right before NBA locks. We want to make sure that we get the most updated news. Hoops Guys, we're about a month and a half, almost 2 months into the NBA season, and with the NFL winding down, if you haven't played NBA yet, come on over and check us out. We're updating content every day. We have projections. We have our interactive value charts. We have multiple articles a day. We have a matchup analysis, which breaks down every single game, gives you basically every single stat that you could want for that game, for every single player. So it's really a gold mine as far as all the data that we have on our site. And then we're interacting with our subscribers every single day. So I'm answering multiple questions multiple times a day. Just trying to help you learn, help you grow, help you learn the game if you've never done it. If you've played a lot of NBA DFS, come check us out as well, because we do have some things that are completely different, such as that matchup analysis that I mentioned. So hoopsguys.com, come check us out as the NFL season comes to an end.
And there you have it, hoopsguys.com. Bookmark it, go there every single day. He's Devin Knotts, and he's not fresh out of an episode of Locked Up. He is one of our DFS kings, including John Lee, who's just a king in general. Jeff Pasquino, that's my dude right there. David Dodds, love listening to him talk about anything. Run it through the phone book. And, of course, BJ VanderWoude coming through with hot DFS takes as well. I'm your host, Cecil Lammy, saying thanks, everyone, for watching and listening. Stay tuned. And as always, stay frosty.
If John had the other side of that bet, his hair might not grow back. So I just make a one-sided bet.
You're not getting any arguments from me.
Okay.